Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Promoted channel. I appreciate you joining me today. The video today is going to be on one of my most popular blog pieces of content that I did at the end of last year, which is a overall upcoming job market prediction and outlook for 2025. Obviously, last year's was for 2024. And I have a feeling this is going to be a significantly longer video than normal that I will break up into a part 1 and part 2. That way it's a little bit better to digest, as well as full transparency. This will be a test of my content creation abilities a little bit. I have yet to do a video this long. I do not script anything. These videos are very organic. I might have some minor notes for myself just to make sure I touch on high points. But if you do have any feedback for this more longer form content, where this is going to stretch a little bit beyond that typical 20 to 25 minute video like I normally do, like I said, I'm going to break it up into 2 parts to hopefully match that similar length. But if you have any feedback for this longer form content, if you want me to dive deeper in certain areas, or you would rather me just make it one big video, please let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, if you like this video, hit the like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and let's dive right in. So 2025 job market outlook is very up in the air and is very difficult to predict. So this is going to come off like a little bit of a political video because that's what's making it sort of a 50-50 scenario. There's a lot of political discussion, policies, and changes that could have upside, could have downside, and I just simply want to present both scenarios to you because we really don't know until it happens. And the other irony is while there's going to be some stuff that might just sound like it's stacking really well, like it's going to lead to good things, there's also a level of order of operations and execution and just unknowns that are going to be presented by this. So please understand that while it's obvious that this is a outlook, so it is a prediction, and that I'm not necessarily saying these are guaranteed going to be what it is, I think more so than the last few years, this year is even more up in the air. Because there's going to be a lot of change, and then you got to wait for that change to make a difference and how much is going to be immediate versus long-term. And we'll address all that in this video. So first and foremost, I actually just want to kind of give you the overall trends that I am seeing in the career coaching space, because there were 3 that I was blown away by this year for me that I did not expect, did not anticipate, and that I think maybe will encourage and give you all some more confidence as well. And the 3 that I saw as a career coach really bump up in 2024 in terms of my clientele were older, either pre-retired or retired people re-entering the workforce, a lot more career transitions due to displacement, whether that was just straight up layoffs or actually jobs being eliminated, and a lot of people looking for a career transition or a new career start due to a relocation. So this was just very interesting that these were not the typical clientele that I've supported in the last, let's say 24 months before this. So 2022 and 2023, the people that I mostly helped in that regard were looking for, from the coaching side, a little more interview training, salary negotiation, but otherwise we're just standard job hunt people. Hey, I was recently laid off, or I, might start looking for a new job. I want you to help me out. It was very much a mixture of proactive and reactive standard job hunt scenario. This year, easily, these 3 camps, when I look back and read the numbers, were about 35% of my clientele across 2024. And that is nowhere near the typical percentage, and especially the older workforce reentry. And so the interesting thing that I thought about this is the Bureau of Labor Statistics also has the same prediction. They don't quite know the number, but like right now, I believe from my previous video, the baby boomer generation is about 11.3% of the workforce and expected to decline, obviously because they're retiring. But what's interesting is the overall percentage of the workforce, they're expected to remain higher than previous generations. So where you might have that decreasing at a 2% year over year rate. So 11.3 was 2024, and then 9.3, 2025, something along those lines. They're expecting that to be a much slower decrease, whether that's due to people delaying their retirement, or like I've seen where people are coming out of retirement or coming out of pre-retirement and re-entering the workforce, is very interesting. And this is usually linked to cost of living, that the money that they had set aside, the retirement that they planned for, the money explosion of inflation has just caused them to have to reenter the workforce in some capacity. And it very much is an uphill battle. So how this affects the job market for 2025 is that understand the competition is going to remain fairly high due to the older workforce staying in longer. And that has its pros and its cons. In terms of they provide more experience, they provide more real world information. But at the same time, if it is this kind of retirement crowd, they've also been out of the workforce a little bit. So companies might view them as a risk, but they're still going to be a part of the talent pool and a part of the job candidate strategy. So just a very interesting statistic that could go either way in terms of a pro or a con for the overall general job candidate of age in terms of your Gen Zers, millennials, and Xers. But just something to keep an eye on. Career transitions, and I'm going to lump this together with the career locations because these kind of go hand in hand, but kind of not. People are exercising the mobility and the technology that we have in 2025, both to displace people and create new jobs and replace, maybe more mundane entry-level type jobs. That's what's causing the transition for a lot of people that were laid off, and they're looking for something more scalable for the long term. And then there's also people that are just saying, hey, I can spend, $2,000-$3,000. I can relocate to a more in-demand area and I can land something that's going to be there long term. It also might be a cheaper cost of living where they're moving. So there's just a lot of factors and people are migrating. They are relocating. And it's just very interesting to see. So for those of you that are out there in the market and have been in a long time, you're competing against people that are willing to relocate, especially for those of you that are demanding full remote. Hybrid work, on-site work is increasing a lot more as well across not just large companies, but it's trickling down into the, let's say step down from large, medium to large and even small businesses as well. And they're getting their workforce by having people relocate. And then the irony here is that it costs them potentially a one-time relocation fee as a company and are bringing people in. So I really think that everybody needs to reevaluate their ability and capability for relocation and for moving and going to where the jobs are and actually weighing, hey, how much am I going to make over here and how much does it cost to live over here and what's the lifestyle like? And we as a people really need to embrace the level of technology and the ease at which relocation comes. And I don't see this shift changing. I do believe that the increase in hybrid and on-site work is going to continue. I think there's a lot of data to support it. I think most data supports hybrid work as the best for organizations from an employee retention, satisfaction, and output perspective, because those are what you have to balance. And the key there as to why remote actually falls down from the data that I've seen is the output. People feel they're more productive or think they're more productive. And they use the excuse of having, the water cooler, people coming by their desk or this or that when they're in the office. But what they also don't realize is at home, they have access to Netflix. They have access to social media. They are just constantly being distracted by the home things that is either breaking even or in some cases worse. So I think that we as a workforce collectively, if we want to thrive, we need to be ready to make career transitions. I will link to the previous videos that I made a couple of weeks ago on the kind of dying careers and skill sets and the improving and high demand careers and skill sets for some different options and opportunities. I'll link those in the description below. But I think we need to be prepared for a career transition, and resting on your laurels now is just not the time with AI and digital transformation. And some people might also need to be willing to relocate. You might need to be willing to uproot yourself and go to where the demand is. As opposed to trying to demand the workforce or the job market and companies to bend to you, because there are people that are willing to do these things, and those people are just going to continue to displace you and beat you out. Again, I'm not saying everybody has to do this because not every company is requiring this, but I do think it's a trend that I am predicting will continue to increase in 2025. So key takeaways for the trends that I've seen this year as a coach and people seeking me out are people on the older spectrum, re-entering the workforce from pre-retirement, retirement, a lot more career transitions, mostly due to displacement by technology and digital transformation. And then people looking for either a career transition or just a job search strategy for an area they're unfamiliar with due to them relocating, either preemptively or reactively. So yeah, that's been my 2024, that I did not see these things coming, especially when comparing it to 2023 and 2022 and the clientele I faced there or helped there. So now we'll dive into a little bit more of the data. And like I said, this is going to come off like a little bit of a political video. It is not intended to be. It is intended to arm you with the information of what is happening and what has been said and what the potential pros, cons, short-term, long-term outcomes are for each of these scenarios. The first piece here is going to be much more just from a data perspective. So I'd like to cover the BLS job market predictions. Then we'll jump into some of the policy stuff around taxes, tariffs, the Department of Government Efficiency, immigration, and the military and defense spending and things like that, and just kind of give you my 2 cents of, like I said, what is the potential for good, what is the potential for bad, and how this really can affect the job market, and both short and long term, because you might have good and bad in the short with good in the long and things like that. So we'll kind of have our little matrix here of covering each of these topics, and that's why I'm expecting this to be a longer video. So if we get into the BLS statistics, so one thing that is very interesting, I mentioned the trend that I'm seeing of the significant career transition due to the displacement and technology and digital transformation, specifically around AI and machine learning. And the BLS did a survey of a few thousand organizations out there, and 75% of companies are planning to adopt some form of AI or cloud computing and big data. Big data in this case really just means significant data analytics to drive decisions. So don't get caught up in the buzzwords. 75% of companies are planning to adopt these advancements in the next 5 years. Now, how that's adopted is going to be the big question mark. And I'll cover that piece a little bit as well. But I think that this very much aligns with the trend that I have seen with the clientele that I am supporting now and helping. And really the biggest thing to know here is it's okay to transition careers. And it's also easier than most people think. I'm not going to sit here and make it out like it's just like any other job search strategy. Like, you do need to put forth effort in terms of potentially some re-education, potentially some certifications, or, broadening your overall horizons and skill set a bit. But again, we are in the technological age and transitioning is easier than it ever has been. So I do think that anybody that is effectively a entry-level position, anything that is very repeatable and mundane, I'm going to think about call centers, customer service, maybe even low level of accounting, finance. On the information technology side, if you're help desk or call center, even maybe junior software development, these sorts of things, QA from a I guess I'll actually go QA across the board, whether this is manufacturing, whether this is software development, whether it's automotive, pick your industry. I think QA can be automated in a large degree in a variety of facets. So think about things where you can really create the SOP. You can effectively hire a human, give them a piece of paper, and then they can perform the job. Those are going to be the jobs that are targeted significantly here. These are going to be the things that in the next couple years are going to be phased out and we'll say replaced with technology, which is then going to generate new jobs and a higher demand in these technology management or robotics management or robotics technicians or even blue collar, right? So kind of gauging in there a little bit. So knowing that 3/4 of companies are planning to adopt this, I mean, even myself as a small business owner, right? I'm a one-man band as a career coach and resume writer. I use cloud computing and artificial intelligence for a variety of functions within my business to make my life easier. And I'm only doing more and more of that as well as I systematize my business, where instead of maybe me hiring, an assistant or a marketing person or a salesperson or these particular functions, I can begin to automate the lower portions of these and AI the lower portions of these to allow me to continue to do these before I have to go spend money on labor. So it's even at the startup level, like the true startup level, that this is going to be huge. So please be ready that if you look at your job and you could fit it on a piece of paper from an instruction standpoint, not a job description standpoint, the job is at risk in the near to long term future. I think the biggest things in 2025, just so since that's the focus of this video, that are going to be impacted, I very much think anything call center related, regardless of the industry. So if we're talking help desk IT support, we're talking technology support, we're talking customer service, hospitality, let's see, technical support centers for, any given industry. I think that is going to be impacted significantly first in 2025. From what I've seen there, most companies like Salesforce and Ada and Intercom are taking their AI chatbot and AI chat services and throwing voice on top of it now that they have a bunch of machine learning and data and information behind it that they've trained it on. And now they can have realistic phone conversations, and that's going to begin to displace that workforce. I also think that, again, entry-level positions in accounting and finance, where it's very repeatable numbers, you're not necessarily dealing with accounts payable, accounts receivable, or vendors negotiation, these sorts of things, but you're kind of building these spreadsheets and doing reconciliation, these sorts of lower level functions, that sort of stuff, I think is going to be significantly impacted in 2025. So like I said, things that are very, very repeatable. So you either need to look to advancing your career to the next level, because the higher you are from a career perspective, the longer it will take for you to be replaced, or you need to look at a skill set that is going to either enable you to be a part of this technological and digital transformation, like a project management, machine learning, software development, information technology, or even going to blue collar. Like I said, I made a video a little while ago as well, where I believe blue collar is the next, we'll say, standard millionaire class. Like that will be the sought after high paying job for quite some time in the foreseeable future. So this is one of the big BLS predictions that also aligns with what I'm seeing from a tactical hands-on clientele perspective. Now, something that might be some good news for everybody, going, a little bit away from the, hardship or doom and gloom of having to transition your career or move up in your career or really put some, fire underneath you, is that the BLS is expecting a much more standard salary increase in 2025. So companies are going to return to that standard kind of 3 to 4% for a normal scenario. Now, obviously, high performers might get more, lower performers might get less. But, I always felt like on any given year when you got that 3 to 4%, that you were probably just doing your job. You weren't the high performer and you weren't the low performer. So when there was a lot of stagnation and people getting 1%, 2%, 0% raises, that's always a bad sign of company health. But they are predicting for people to have a standard 3 to 4% kind of cost of living, maybe cost of living plus 1% with that 4% scenario. Now, where that cost of living comes from as well is from the rate of inflation. And while right now we are in that significant scenario, if we do go back to Trump's previous term, he actually averaged between 1 and 1.5% inflation on any given year. So if you do get that 3 to 4% raise, I'm not going to sit here and, say, oh my gosh, it's a game changer. But at least if he returns us to that in 2025 through the decisions and policies and implementation, then at least you're going to make up 2 to 2.5% of that loss of inflation. And, if you do get that year over year, again, let's assume that things go well. I told you I'd give you good and bad. Let's assume that things go well. And for the next 4 years, you're able to make up that 2% salary gain because inflation remains super low, but we retain that 3 to 4%. Then you're talking somewhere between 8 and 10% that you're going to make up in that inflation rate over the next 4 years. Again, it's still not going to fully outpace in terms of making up for all of the inflation over the last 4 years. But I believe when you do the cumulative inflation rate, that would knock out about 40% of it, if I recall correctly. So that's a potential pro. Now, at the same time, if we have the opposite, where the inflation continues, it stays at a higher rate, then this isn't going to be that big of an impact. So there's a level of just how these policies and things really play out, but there is the potential for you to start to feel the easing of your day-to-day cost of living, not just from the cost itself, but from the way that the raises are interacting with the present inflation rate of the upcoming term. So like I said, this is a 50-50 shot. We'll get into more of the policies and the potential there. But just know that if we have a return to Trump's first term, that we could start to make up some of that daily pain. But there's so many factors here. So, but that's at least nice to return to a normal raise rate from the prediction standpoint. And the other one, and this is going to actually circle back a little bit to the 75% of companies and the transitions that I'm seeing, is the fastest growing and most in-demand careers. Like I said, I'll link the video below to the previous ones that I did, but it's going to be computer and mathematical occupations to support the machine learning, AI, and digital transformation. And then it's also healthcare support. Healthcare is in a huge labor shortage from a nurse practitioner and doctor perspective. Ironically, some aspects are being replaced in this digital transformation as well. When you look at surgeries and robotics, you look at what machines are able to do and interpreting information. There's even talks about, we'll say, AI doctors, if you will, for your regular scheduled checkup and maintenance stuff, with just going in for your physical or getting your blood work done and being able to have that conversation about what these things mean. What is the interpretation? What changes can you make from a lifestyle perspective? What has already been done? Analyzing medical history. So just sort of the low-hanging fruit, there's a level that gets replaced, which would overall reduce the cost of the healthcare industry from the consumer perspective, because you're not having to necessarily pay a $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 salary just for your regular scheduled checkups, or at least the maintenance of your health perspective. Costs outside of that would be different, but so yeah, there's an interesting level of growth where these things actually coincide together, of the computer mathematical occupation and the healthcare support. So again, summing up and bringing those things back to the overall BLS predictions. BLS is Bureau of Labor Statistics for the United States. In 2025, they're predicting that 75% of companies will adopt some form of AI, big data, cloud computing in the coming years. So not specifically in 2025, but over the next, we'll say 3 to 5 years, I believe was the survey. They're anticipating a 3 to 4% annual raise, returning to that normal standard rate. And then the highest in-demand occupations are going to be the computer mathematical and the healthcare support. And that's also what I found in my kind of deeper dive research from those videos I did a couple of weeks ago. All right, so now we get into the potentially controversial part of this video. So I'm going to approach this from a variety of perspectives. They're gonna kind of intertwine in some categories. So I will lay out what I want to address topically, and then, like I said, there might be a little bit of weaving in and out here, but I'm going to try to stick to each topic individually. And some of these have a lot of factors and a lot of things to cover for short term and long term, as well as pros and cons. Please understand, I'm just trying to present for you the information so that you can learn to be more effective, or you could be prepared to be more effective. So the key topics here of what has come out of the upcoming political changes are going to be around tariffs and taxes, the formation of DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, immigration changes, and then also significant military changes. I will touch on maybe some optionals as well, depending on the time, around entitlements and some other things in that regard. But I feel like these are kind of the key big four that have a lot of sub things to discuss. And so, like I said, this will probably be broken up into a part 1 and part 2, especially since we're already almost 25 minutes in. Maybe might even bleed to more parts than that. We shall see. So the first one is going to be the biggest lump of this entire discussion, I imagine, which is going to be tariffs. So let's start at level 1 here. What is a tariff? A tariff is a tax that is going to be imposed on the act of importing and exporting goods produced by a country and its population. So, for instance, if you take a Ford Bronco that is manufactured here in the US and you send that over to Germany in Europe, there's going to be a tax that we have to pay as the United States, that in order to sell that Ford car in Germany. Now, at the moment, the current automotive import tax in this exact scenario is on average 8%, but most of the time it ends up actually being about 10%, because it's 10% on completed vehicles, and then it's a different percentage for like parts and maintenance and things like that. So that's where the average ends up being 8%. But 10% is really what you want to think about for the ease and simplicity of this explanation. So this means that if you have a car that costs $50,000, or that's what it would normally sell for in the US, that there's at least going to be a 10% markup of some capacity in order to maintain the same revenue stream. So it's going to be 50,000 here in the US, and it would be 55,000 over there in Germany. Now, this is how that 5,000 gets paid. That's where you have a lot of question marks and a lot of negotiation. Some of it's going to be paid by Ford. Some of it's going to be paid by the German citizens. Some of it might even be paid by the German government. There's just a lot of variables at play as to who pays for that tariff. Most of the time, it gets split between the consumer and the manufacturer. If there are a level of subsidies provided by the government, so maybe there might be subsidies for electrical vehicles like there are right now, or and the Ford Bronco was an EV, then there might be a level of government that just kind of absorbs that tariff, so on and so forth. But this means that this would make the U.S. more money in this instance, because Germany is going to have to pay that $5,000, and then how that gets spread from the German government between the citizens and Ford is the question mark. But we would in turn bring more revenue into this country because of that 10%. Sorry, the German government would break in that 10%. They would make more money. My apologies, because they are the ones that tax revenue would go to. So the German government would make 10%, and that is paid for, is usually split between the consumer and the manufacturer. Okay, so that is what a tariff is functionally. Now, the key things to note here is this can be both good and bad from the consumer perspective and the job market perspective. So the theoretical, let's just say all things going hunky-dory, here's the ideal positive as to what tariffs can do. So by having tariffs on U.S. goods, theoretically, we have two different aspects that are positive for the U.S. job market. The first is that companies themselves will make more money because they are going to get a piece of that revenue from the tariff itself. So they have higher revenue streams now, and for being the one that produces and exported that good. Now, the second piece in this scenario is that if the tariff is high enough that you might have a little bit of demand, well, actually, there's three aspects. Demand decrease abroad, that there might be a increase in U.S. demand because the foreign, so what we are importing here in the United States, might go up in cost if we put additional tariffs on what we are importing. And then now you look at what your $50,000 gets from a U.S.-made vehicle versus what your $50,000 gets from a Japanese-made vehicle. So there could be a demand increase here locally on U.S. vehicles, which would then increase the revenue of the companies, which would then generate more jobs, which would then keep that going. And then the third aspect is that depending on the negotiation of the tariff, right, you could actually reduce the tariffs on U.S. goods abroad by the threat or the implementation of U.S.-based tariffs for foreign imported goods, and then this would actually increase the global demand. So if we make all three of these tactical, right? So again, there is they put the 20% tariff on all Japanese vehicles. So this would make those vehicles 20% more expensive, usually, like I said, split between consumer and producer. This would then raise the price. That would make people maybe not be able to afford or not want to pay for the price tag of the Japanese vehicle and then buy Fords. So they buy the Ford vehicle instead. This then causes Ford's revenue to go up, which then causes them to expand their operations, produce more jobs, and reinvest that money accordingly. So that's one scenario. Now, let's say that, again, we'll stick with the Germany example and Ford here. So the U.S. threatens to say, hey, all German cars, so Mercedes, Volkswagen, BMW, etc., they're going to get a 40% tariff if you don't remove or reduce the 10% tariff on American goods that are imported, or American vehicles that are imported into Germany. We agree mutually that if you don't remove or reduce this 10% tariff to put American vehicles competitive with German vehicles in Germany, then we're going to put a 40% tariff on your German-made vehicles in the U.S., which would significantly reduce this market. And so then this is almost like a mutually assured destruction. to where now both people drop their tariffs and now everything is cheaper and you have a more competitive market. And now we increased our global demand, which then generates the revenue for Ford. Again, I'm presenting all the happy hunky-dory scenarios. So if everything goes perfect here. And then the third example from just the imposing a tariff where there is no tariff and how that would increase revenue. So usually companies' revenue or margin is a percentage based. So it's a percentage of the price tag number. So if that price tag were to increase, then the percentage, the end resulting flat number, therefore then increases as well. So let's go back to that same example we had before. If there was a 10% tariff on American-made vehicles in Germany, and there's, so that went from $50,000 to $55,000. Well, now if your margin is, we'll say your margin is 10%. So before they were making $5,000 on that $50,000. Now you're making $5,500 on the $55,000. So now every vehicle sold is an additional $500 in revenue. So that's just how by having a tariff period, end of story, that usually the percentage of margin then ends up in a higher flat number because the good itself costs more as well. So those are 3 different scenarios that tariffs can help out the overall companies and generate revenue in order to facilitate the job market. Yeah, there's a lot to kind of intertwine and unpack here. And so I like using the automotive example because it is actually easy numbers with the 10% between US and Europe and things like that. And so now we're going to get a little bit into just macro economy for a second before we bring it back to the job market. And so just for an idea here or a real world explanation. So the current tariff on US cars imported to Europe is 10%. The other way around, so European cars coming to the US is 2.5%. What this leads to is Europe is exporting 5 times the amount of cars that the US is to Europe, vice versa. And this exact number ends up being, we send Europe roughly 267,000 cars a year. They send us 1.1 million. And this results in a 7x revenue increase for the European economy in general. So we make roughly 6.3 billion in revenue on vehicles in Europe. They make 41 billion in America by selling their vehicles here. So if we just simply even that out, right, and we went to the 10% on that aspect, then now we're making things a little bit more level. But if, just imagine that if we were to 7x our automotive increase across the board, right? If we were to match their $40 billion in revenue, and, obviously we don't know what the margin is. We don't know what the exact profits are. But if car companies in Europe alone 7x their revenue, how much more money and how much more demand is there, right? I mean, that's 5 times the vehicles sold in one region. So they immediately have to increase supply. They immediately have to create more jobs. They have to build more factories. They have to do that just to meet the demand if it evens it out. And keep in mind, this is for one region of the world. So imagine we, 5x the demand of Europe, South America, Asia, and Europe. We did it everywhere. Now we're talking millions and millions of cars and, hundreds of billions of dollars of revenue. So this is how we can create jobs through the tariff scenario. Now, how can it hurt the job economy? Let's talk about that. So tariffs also had the potential negative that if implemented incorrectly, or let's say, again, going back to that 40% versus 10% kind of negotiation tactic, and the bluff was called, for instance, and it wasn't a bluff. Well, now consumers are just harmed in general because now everything is so expensive, demand plummets, supply increases. Now, in theory, this would overall reduce the cost of the cars because people are now not buying them as much in general. But because revenue is down, because nobody is buying, while each side is waiting each other out and playing their relative game of chicken, the consumer is harmed. Revenue is decreased for these organizations. Therefore, they're probably going to have to do layoffs because they aren't generating the revenue in order to facilitate the operational expenses that it's costing them. Or they're going to shut down factories because, the demand is so low at this point that they're saying, hey, we don't need this level of production. We need to cut our production by 20%. So there is this significant potential negative. And this is where it's very much a art of the deal scenario. It is very much a negotiation back and forth of trying to correct the overall trade deficits that currently are present in the country. And so just to give you an idea of the revenue on the table, just from a trade deficit perspective, is it's almost $775 billion a year is how much the U.S. loses due to its trade deficits. Some countries, if you were to look at Canada or Mexico, those deficits have tripled since 2017. So having quality trade deals that increases the revenue generation is what's going to allow the job market to expand in this tariff scenario. So again, it could go both ways. I'm not presenting like we need to go the tariff route. This is the solution to everything. And I'm also not saying it can't help solve the problem, because it absolutely can. Again, a single industry, we're talking about 7xing the revenue for automotive just in the European market. That's the potential. If we made up $775 billion every single year, how many jobs is that? How much company expansion is that if that were to be reinvested? And, again, I know I wanted to kind of separate a little bit tariffs and taxes, but to just give a tax example, I know this is not money savings, but that this is actual revenue generation. But if we go back to the previous round of Trump tax cuts, there was an after the fact study done in 2018 or 2019, I believe, by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and companies reinvested 20% of the tax cut savings back into the organization, specifically for workforce and technology. So if we were to, again, make up this $775 billion, 20% of that is going to be roughly $155 billion. How many jobs is that? How many people is that hiring? How much expansion and manufacturing is that? So that can be the true power. And that's assuming they stick to that 20% again, right? It could be 30, it could be 40, it could be 5, it could be 2, it could be 0. So they could just take it to line their pockets. Again, there's a lot of variables at play here, but understanding the potential and being prepared for both the good and the bad is going to be key here. And I think that if we break this down to short-term, long-term, I think that it depends on how the negotiations go. That's really what this boils down to. Because if the trade negotiations are put out there, and let's say that, the threat of tariffs overall reduces tariffs, then, from the goods that we are importing, then we actually kind of get the best of both worlds. Very quickly, costs come down because manufacturers aren't paying these taxes, aren't paying this, potentially unnecessary fee that is just artificially making things more expensive. So now your day-to-day living becomes cheaper because that tariff doesn't exist on what's being imported anymore, and vice versa. Now American products are also competitive more globally because they aren't having, an outsized tariff like they do now, for instance, in automotive, where it's 4 times higher of a tariff in Europe for a US car than a European car in the US. So now the demand globally increases. And so again, this would increase demand, increase revenue generation, increase expansion and supply, and create jobs and really get these things flowing. So it really depends on how those negotiations go, that if people are reasonable and come to a conclusion very quickly, then we could see reduce of goods come down very quickly, which is a win-win for the job market, because now your salaries go farther. Those 3 to 4% raises predicted by the BLS goes farther. And now jobs are increasing as well because global demand for the products and services and goods produced in the US are also increasing. So we got a win-win-win across the board. But like I said, the downside, negotiations don't go well. Then you potentially have a game of chicken where just everything is more expensive for an unknown period of time until someone caves on the game of chicken. It could also never cave. So then the long-term benefit is, so short-term you see prices go up because literally it is more expensive for the goods to be sold in the US. It also could be more expensive for the US goods to be sold globally. So if we go, ultimate negative, it's that, right? So now everything you have to buy on a day-to-day perspective is more expensive. Globally, demand for US goes down. And so now you have a double demand loss because domestically you don't have the money, or your money doesn't go as far. So you're not buying as much. Globally, demand is down because it's more expensive and the money doesn't go as far. So it goes down. Now you have this significant drop from the workforce reinvestment and revenue perspective, that there's going to be mass layoffs and industry changes as well. So again, this is a double-edged sword, and it's going to depend on how those negotiations and implementation go as to how this is going to affect the job market. And just to kind of how this also can go into an additional level of taxes. So one of the interesting things about the addition, because ultimately tariffs are a form of tax. So that's why I'm kind of lumping in other tax things and some intertwinings here together, is there has been talk of replacing all income tax with tariffs. And so this would be an interesting one. Because if everything, did get some sort of blanket tariff, but you reduce the income tax, then realistically, I actually think this ends up being a net positive for the job market. And I'll explain both the positive and the negative here. So how there would be the theoretical positive is, let's just say you did an even 1-to-1. So the average, salary and tax bracket, I think ends up being about 20% that people pay in taxes. And so if you just did a blanket tariff on all goods, 20%, and then you did a 20% tax cut. So now you have 20% back in your pocket. You don't have any federal income tax. So now you only actually lose the 20% on what you spent. So if you took that 20% that you now have back in your pocket, and let's just say you didn't spend any of it, you chose to invest 100% of it into the stock market, into crypto, into real estate, into gold, into a business startup, whatever it might be, it does not matter. Everyone actually kind of wins in this scenario, because while, yes, like to some degree, your life is more expensive by that 20%, but now your money is growing. So you are building wealth over time, which then would allow you to spend more money over time. So short term, the economy probably takes a hit, but long term, because people were to be more wealthy, they actually end up being able to spend more money in the economy. And so in the long run, it would circulate and ramp up. Now, let's say it was split. You decided to spend the 10% and reinvest the 10%. So now the economy wins even more, because you still have that long-term benefit of the 10% growth, but then you're also putting 10% more money into the economy from a demand perspective that people are willing to spend. So this is going to buy more goods, which is increasing demand, which therefore means companies are getting more revenue and have to reinvest to keep up with the increased demand by producing more supply. So the fact that you could selectively choose where your money goes, and it really allows for a true market determination of where this revenue goes and where it's invested, that's the potential positive from the job market perspective, that if you made that trade of tariff for income tax. If you end up with both, now we're back to that same double negative scenario I presented with tariffs in general, where you just have your overall demand plummeting because people's money isn't going as far, they can't buy the same goods, and they're continuing to be taxed, and they haven't realized anything in their pocket. So it's just a plummeting, spiraling demand if they retain both of these things. So it needs to be some sort of balance for the job market to lead to more demand and more job creation. And the other big tax change that has been discussed, aside from the income tax scenario, is the corporate tax rate reduction. So again, going back to the previous tax cuts that primarily went to the corporate level, it resulted in 20% of that money savings being reinvested. So there is talk of reducing the corporate tax rate even further from 21% to 15% at the federal level. And so again, this would lead to an immediate, let's take that standard 20% number, because that's the best real world number we have in recent history. So that's actually applicable. We're not looking back 50 years for it. We're literally looking back 6 years for it. Taking that 20% and reinvesting of that 6% savings and putting it into reinvestment to the workforce and technology. And again, to use some real world numbers here, if you have a company that is worth, we'll just use $1 billion, right? They are taxed at 21%. Then now you're talking that's 210 million that they are paying in taxes, and that's going to drop to 150 million. So they just saved 60 million. 20% of that's 12 million. So a single $1 billion company now has $12 million to reinvest in technology and workforce. That's split 50-50. You got 6 million in jobs. If we break that down even further, $6 million in actual workforce and jobs. The average salary of somebody in the U.S. is $60,000. So I believe that would put you at, is that 10,000 jobs, 100,000 jobs? I believe that's 10,000 jobs. So it's for a single company. And so that's kind of the power. No, that's going to be 1,000 jobs for a single company. So like that's the power that this 6% tax reduction can have is if they just maintain that simple 20% reinvestment, the other 80%, maybe a reinvestment into other things. It might not be workforce and technology. It could be facility expansion. It could be global expansion. It could be production overhaul. It also could just be investing more in the current employees, right? It doesn't have to be expansion, but it could actually just be salary increases, bonuses, etc., so on and so forth. So that's the other big tax change that could ultimately go that would be the positive route is they maintain that 20%. The negative route here really would just be if there's no offsetting of government expenditure. Then by decreasing the government revenue, then you're increasing our deficit and debt even more at the government level, which increases inflation, which gives other countries more leverage over us. So when we do go to those negotiation tables for these tariffs and trade deficits, we have less leverage. I think that would be your overall negative. And that parlays really nicely into DOGE, the meme department, the Department of Government Efficiency. Before we dive into that, though, I want to real quick recap the tariff scenario. So tariffs are ultimately just taxes on imported and exported goods. They have the ability that by making the tariffs a level playing field, we increase demand globally. Domestically, doesn't really change much, but we increase global demand, which would then increase overall revenue and job creation. If the negotiations lead to tariff elimination, then now we have increased global demand and increased domestic demand potentially as well. So there's that scenario. If we then have the overall negotiation and implementation about how that goes, and there's a potential game of chicken that, bluffs are called, threats are made, and then that just leads to a significantly higher cost for consumer, demand plummets because everything is more expensive, wages have stagnated, etc. There's the income tax scenario where income tax could be abolished and replaced with the tariffs. That overall, I think that would be a net positive because you now get to choose where to selectively spend your money, and you only now get taxed on the goods that you buy. You are not blanketly taxed on all of the money you earn. So as long as you invest, save, etc., a percentage of this, the income tax elimination allows you to win over the tariff implementation scenario. Corporate tax rate going from 21% to 15%. Would result in significant job creation, theoretically, by maintaining the previous 20% reinvestment into technology and workforce that was done under the previous tax cuts done by Trump. Give me a second. I got to take a sip of water here, audience. I appreciate it. Okay. So the bad scenario I mentioned with the corporate tax reduction rate, as well as the income tax reduction, actually, no, that maybe not apply. There, the income tax reduction, if we were to eliminate that at the cost of tariffs, then actually the government would generate more revenue, or at least the same revenue theoretically. So there isn't that same negative as there is with the corporate tax. Corporate tax potential negative is if we reduce the revenue going to the government and without offsetting any sort of costs by the government itself. So now we're just increasing the debt and increasing the deficit. And this is really what you saw underneath the previous Trump administration, is he was slowly starting to decrease government expenditure, but was not able to keep up his decreasing or really implement his strategies for the latter part of year 3 and year 4 for decreasing spending and while decreasing revenue. And this led to an increased deficit and increased debt, which overall the consumer still won and the job market pretty much won, but it really isn't something that's sustainable over the long term. So this is what leads us into talking about DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. So there's 3 main aspects to what DOGE is planning to do and what they have announced and how this can affect the job market. So They are talking about significant government layoffs and agency consolidation, deregulation across the government as a whole, and an education system overhaul. So these all affect the workforce in a pretty significant way. And the key distinction in a lot of these that we'll break down are going to be short-term and long-term. So if we start here with the government layoffs and agency consolidation. So we'll kind of present the extreme scenario. So head of DOGE is Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. Vivek famously is shooting to have a 75% reduction in workforce of government employees. So there's the good side here, which is reduce government expenditure significantly, which now if we maintain the same revenue or even increase it or, swap it in those capacities, then now we start to make the U.S. a more powerful economy because we can start to make up the debt. But from the job market perspective, the short-term downside of this is significantly increased workforce supply. Again, we're a lot of the economy in general, whether it's macro or micro, is supply and demand. So by increasing the workforce supply, the demand isn't going to change for some time. So now you just have increased competition. You might even have a level of wage stagnation or even wage decrease. Again, right? What happens with supply and demand? If you have super high demand for jobs with low supply, the people that are now fulfilling it usually make more money. Flip side, you have super high supply with really low demand or a stagnating demand, then now your kind of wages and costs and negotiation power decrease. So this is the short-term issue with the government layoffs. And again, this goes back to implementation because I've heard a couple different ways of this being done and proposed, and we'll kind of break these down. So if we had the significant layoff scenario, the most effective way that I think would be the least short-term impacting would be the mass layoff with a severance package of like a 2-year payoff scenario that is either, it's essentially trickled out over on your standard pay cycle for the government people. And the other thing that I've heard to incentivize people to try to land a job or re-enter the workforce quickly is that when you land a job, you would just get all of that at once. So the government still pays the same amount of money over the grand scheme. Now, there's a short-term macroeconomic hit because you would increase the government spending within the given calendar or fiscal year. But you know that, it's a counting clock from effectively like, okay, in 24 months from now, government spending is about to plummet. So that's one way that I heard, right? Again, so you still are incentivizing people to land a job, but I think that some people are going to go on sabbatical. They're going to relax. They're going to take a few months, maybe even take the full 2 years. So it will not, just jolt that supply of workforce like it would if everybody was just laid off and told to go figure it out tomorrow. As well as I think that would be a real downside because it would decrease revenue for most companies because a significant chunk of your workforce, your customer base of government employees as everyday consumers now doesn't have the money to spend either. So I think it's just a lose-lose overall if you don't do something like this. I have heard just the general layoff scenario proposed by some people. And like I said, I already presented that. I think that's a lose-lose. You lose money in the economy, you lose revenue for companies, and at the same time, increasing supply of workforce and decreasing demand of goods. And that's just a recipe for disaster. So I don't think that that's going to happen. And that would not be ideal. So the implementation really is going to be the effective thing here. But in the long term, this also should almost in every given scenario end up in a win. And the reason being is because the government doesn't generate revenue. It doesn't make money. It doesn't make the consumer's life any better. There is no good or service that they create per se. So by taking this giant workforce displacement, putting it into the private sector, your production is now going to significantly increase. And again, we couple this with the way that tariffs can be implemented and you have a level of supply or demand increase, which means you need more supply. Then now you have more productive people in society producing more things and producing more value, which means you can deliver more. And so now you have a significant, we'll say GDP growth, a significant output increase in what we are doing. And so in the long term, companies should be winning from a revenue and profit perspective by having more people to do more things and increase the demand and selling and market penetration globally. So in the long run, this should almost always end up in a positive scenario, but there could be that potential for the short-term pain due to the increased workforce supply. Now, the other aspect, so deregulation. So this is one that more often than not should just flat out end up in increased company revenue and increased reinvestment. Again, a lot of the deregulation efforts that were attempted to happen in Trump's previous administration not necessarily came to fruition. But again, if we keep with the same benchmark of 20% operational savings, go reinvest it into workforce and technology, that is what deregulation is going to do. So and this also has the other positive benefit of allowing your money to go farther. I definitely am going to blank here, but there was a big study done of Fortune 500 companies. It was in the early 2020s. It was, I believe it was during COVID, maybe it was right after COVID, that essentially said, what is your biggest preventative for doing business? And it is regulation. It's not cost of doing goods. It's not supply of workforce. It's not sourcing goods. It's not any of this stuff. It really was the regulation aspect is what most companies said, agnostic of their industry. So by taking their shackles off of deregulation, then they have more money to spend on more people and produce more goods. You also get more R&D because they can test out new products. And does this mean that some things are going to flop? Does this mean that there's going to be, potentially some safety issues from time to time? There might be, but all of that will be market corrected. So I think that the overall short and long term of deregulation is a win-win. And I think this has been shown historically when you look at, for instance, the Reagan administration. If you go back to FDR and you look at the regulation increases there, you had a negative impact from regulation increase. If you look at the most prosperous times in the U.S. history, from the late 1800s to the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, you had a stagnation of regulation or a decrease. So there's just so many times in history where deregulation usually leads to a win-win across the board because goods are cheaper, so people are spending more money, which means higher revenue generation, more job creation. You have companies who are saving money, taking that money and reinvesting a portion of it back into the workforce and technology as well. So deregulation, again, done correctly and done well, there's always this caveat with everything, should just really end up in a net positive. I don't really see how this could negatively impact the job market itself. Now, the only way that this really could is if you have major companies violating social and societal values. For instance, if you deregulate environmental and you end up, polluting a significant chunk of a given forest or a given body of water, and this just causes your reputation to tank and that company falters, then that would be like the level of job market impact. But unless it's a sector of the economy or product production that is only done by this one company, which is almost never the case, then it's just going to shift to another company. It's going to shift to a different market competitor. It's just going to shift somewhere else where that money is being spent and how people are fulfilling the need that the one company violated what we want as a social company or as a society of what we want companies to uphold from good moral values. So I think the deregulation just across the board from a job market specific perspective does not really have the ability to negatively impact short or long term. I think this is just pure positive for job market only. Again, not saying deregulation is 100% a positive thing all the time. The scope of this video is job market. And the last one from DOGE is the education system overhaul. And so this is an interesting one because the details aren't necessarily there. The biggest thing that we know is they want to abolish the Department of Education at the federal level. So this one is going to be interesting. I almost see no short-term benefit or negative at all. When you really look at what the federal education system does, they don't standardize the curriculum. They don't standardize anything of what people learn. They simply produce funding. That's it. That's really what their job is to provide funding from at the federal level to the given states. If you continue to enable states to produce their curriculums, spend their education money how they want, and you really create a marketplace of competition within education, then this is going to take a long time to realize these effects. But this is why I worded it as education system overhaul, is when you remove the federal barrier, then now you have states and individual schools competing with each other. You don't have this crazy government funding going to your Ivy League and not, D2 or D3 schools, or, those sort of lesser schools, or the athletic programs getting a significant boost from the government and not actually making money off of their actual athletic program. And so I think that this makes a significantly more competitive and effective education system in the long run, which should lead to a more productive workforce sooner. Because anybody that is from a manager or higher, like you have been a part of hiring, firing, performance reviews, etc. So I'm not going to necessarily put an age point here, but I'm going to put that prerequisite. You have been a manager or higher in your given career, potentially even supervisor. The amount of people that we can all admit that we have seen that are fresh graduates, 22, 24, 26, 28, whatever, and are just utterly useless in the economy and their job market is asinine. It is off the charts. So the education system needs some form of overhaul to increase the effectiveness. And right now, there's no incentive to. A lot of the top universities get most of their money from the government, not even necessarily tuition, and also the athletic programs. And so, what's the point? Where if you are competing and you sit here, and I'm going to throw out a completely hypothetical. But if you're looking at maybe like Virginia Tech, which is a top engineering school, but it's not Ivy League, they come out and because, they lose this oversight, they now have a little bit more freedom. They negotiate with the states and they start producing 90% of our graduates come out and are earning six figures within 24 months. And then you got Harvard, a current Ivy League top school, they come out and 70% of their graduates are coming out with six-figure salaries in 24 months. Where are you going to go? Right? If you actually make universities compete and spend their money effectively, same thing with the K through 12 scenario. If you do something like a school choice where you allow people to pick their high school, pick their middle school, etc., and kind of pick the better one in the area, and certain schools are losing their students, which means that they don't have the funding. They, teachers start to have to go to work for other schools. Those schools have to expand because they're more effective. In order for those teachers to actually work there, they have to be better teachers so that it just creates this vicious cycle of when you make the education system competitive and based on results, that you actually end up with the best education system possible. I think you end up with a workforce production increase. This is, like I said, no short term at all. I think the abolishment of the education system, the only short term benefit is the money saving from the government itself. But I don't think it's going to have the workforce impact until the education system itself has gone through that overhaul. So recap here, big three from DOGE and kind of the short and long-term benefits here. So you got the government layoffs and agency consolidation. So by doing this, you're going to increase the workforce supply, which in the long run should always win because workforce increase from a supply perspective means more production, which means more revenue, which means more expansion, and also more demand because more people are making more money and working. Now, the short term is sort of that 50-50 scenario. So in the short term, it depends on how they do it. If they do what they've, what some people have proposed of saying, hey, we're going to do a 2-year pay cycle severance package, then it's not going to be as jolting because some people are going to take longer to re-enter the workforce. Some people are going to enjoy that money and some people are going to re-enter immediately. But so the short term is almost guaranteed actually like a somewhat negative impact because you have the workforce increase, whether it's 10% of people choose to go back immediately or 100%. I think that's where the implementation can vary. And as well as from a macroeconomics perspective, if you do pull this off, then you're also decreasing the operating revenue of the government itself, which therefore would theoretically lead to smaller deficits, debt reduction, and would give us more leverage in the overall negotiations of the global economy. But again, that stuff isn't realized for longer. Deregulation, I almost see no negative to this from a workforce job outlook perspective. This should almost guaranteed 100% of the time lead to increased jobs because there's increased revenue, more R&D, faster company expansion, which then just means that they're going to hire more people, expand their markets, expand the production facilities, etc. And then the education system overhaul, essentially eliminating the Federal Department of Education. It's essentially the same thing as the government layoffs from the people perspective, but in the short term, I think it matches that same pros and cons. Long term, this should end up in a huge win because it will spark a more competitive education space, which therefore should lead to a more productive workforce, which means that when this really comes to fruition, and if I had to do a guesstimate here, I'm going to say it's probably going to take 5 to 10 years, that your fresh graduates are much, much, much more useful. So that's how I think that these DOGE changes can come into play. Immigration. So this is one that is very interesting. And again, kind of has that dichotomy of pros, cons, short-term, long-term. So the initial mission with the immigration changes that are up in the upcoming administration is to simply get rid of the criminals that are here illegally. I don't see that having any sort of job market outlook in the grand scheme. If they are criminals, then they're probably not necessarily contributing to taxes or having legally employed jobs, so on and so forth. So I think that's going to be negligible. So the short and long term here is really going to depend on how long it takes them to accomplish that mission before they go on to the next one. Now, the other short term scenario that they want to do immediately is just simply slow down or eliminate the illegal immigration as a whole. Now, this would have a job market outlook because, again, there's a percentage of the illegal immigrants that are going to seek jobs and a percentage that are not. The percentage that are, this is now going to open up some of those lower wage jobs, entry-level jobs that they typically fill within agriculture or manufacturing or, trade labor, these sorts of things that otherwise would be filled by a legal citizen. So this should actually affect the supply side of the workforce, which would mean more job openings. So that aspect, if they are able to slow down or eliminate the illegal immigration, which will probably be slowed down versus elimination as a whole, then that's how that would affect the workforce. Is it theoretically should have more openings for companies to then give to either legal immigrants or just citizens in general. Now, long-term here, this is where it gets very interesting because long-term deportation actually is a decrease of workforce supply. So that should continue that same pro that I gave just a second ago, but it's also a decrease in demand and a decrease in consumption of goods and services as a whole. So this really, I think, is kind of a break even and a trade from an outlook perspective. So this is where I think that really just the short and long-term benefit of the proposed immigration changes between the initial deportation of criminals and then subsequent deportations based on other categories, and then the preventing of illegal immigration. I really think the only job force outlook here is the continuation of the decreasing of supply side workforce. And so I think that that's kind of the key thing to take away with the proposed immigration changes as a whole. So theoretically, more people can be employed. Now, the other aspect is on the deportation front is there has been talk about once they get past that criminal objective to the degree that they are deeming it checked off. What about dreamers? What about the productive people? What about these other aspects? And when it comes to people that are here illegally but are productive, I have heard deport them anyway. I have heard we find a pathway to citizenship, that we figure out a green card scenario. So all of that's up in the air. But again, this could have both short-term and long-term positive and negative. So if they decided to keep everybody, find a pathway to citizenship, green card, whatever the solution might be, but they're allowed to stay, then I think that this just really maintains a lot more of the status quo. in terms of whatever the supply side effect is from the deportation that does occur and the preventing of illegal immigration as a whole. That supply side just continues on its path. But if they chose to deport all of these people, then you have a little bit of a nuanced discussion, because again, we're back to that break even of the decreased supply and decreased demand within the economy. But what you're actually at a nuanced discussion of is productivity versus labor cost in this exchange. So if you did have the illegals that they decided to deport, and theoretically that opens up more jobs, so, or, for, either legal immigrants or citizens to fill, great. Let's say you did that one for one, but what is their cost, right? Usually the illegals are operating at a cheaper cost. And so this is sort of like a minimum wage debate to some degree. And so if the labor that you're replacing them with is the same or is more cost, same productivity, consumers actually lose from a job market perspective because revenue is down for companies, so they lose reinvestment. If cost is the same, production is the same, then it's continuing maintaining status quo. It's obvious that if the costs were less of the labor that replaced the illegal immigrants and productivity stayed the same, then that's just a win-win. But we can all admit that's not going to be the case. If you have the more expensive route, which is likely to be the case, and you have increased productivity, then now we're back to that break-even trade-off scenario. So this is one that it's a little bit more nuanced when you go to deport or get the illegals out that are productive members of society in the economy. This is a very nuanced and dicey discussion. And I do think that, they are leaning a little bit more towards finding a way to keep them in the United States and a pathway to citizenship and so on and so forth. So the immigration one, like I said, it's a very interesting scenario. Its biggest potential impact by preventing illegal immigration and deporting, we'll say, non-productive and criminal illegal immigrants in this country, that is going to open up those entry-level, lower-paying jobs for legal immigrants and American citizens. So I think that would overall be a win for the economy in that scenario. But the other aspects of deporting the rest of people or this and that, it's a lot more nuanced and probably more often than not ends up in a net negative from the economy and job market perspective, because revenue would be down due to wages increasing for non-illegal immigrants, as well as cost of goods then going up, and less revenue because people aren't paying it more, demand is down, and so on and so on. It just creates this vicious cycle of rising costs, which then decreases demand, which then means that there's less for reinvestment. So I think that immigration, the best case scenario is that preventing of illegal immigration based on the policies they've said, and deporting the non-productive members of society, and that will be a win-win from the economy perspective. Now, another one here that is very interesting that I think a lot of people overlook and that the conversation has not been focused on is how to actually make the military a revenue generation machine. So this is some interesting conversation that I have seen between, I believe, Pete Hegseth, a couple different kind of podcasters and people in the cabinet of Trump and things like that. But and if we also go back to Trump's first term, one of his big revenue boosters in the U.S. from the government perspective to help contribute to decreasing the deficit and the debt and also help with trade relations during his tenure was the NATO negotiations. So, hey, we are going to defend our allies. We absolutely will. But you're going to pay what you were supposed to pay, which was a percentage of your GDP, for us to be there to defend you. And so that's going to be a core piece here to bring back, because that has since been eliminated. So some things to kind of note here. So the U.S. has 750 military bases worldwide. Our top 5 troop placements, 53,000 in Japan, 35,000 in Germany, 24,000 in South Korea, 12,500 in Italy, and 10,000 in the UK. These all have the ability to generate revenue, especially when you look at Japan and Germany, where we have significant trade deficits. And I think Japan might be our largest debt holder for us. If not, they're at least like top 2, top 3. We can look at the value of the troops and the military protection we're providing and saying, hey, you're going to eliminate this chunk of our debt, or because of this, here's what you're going to do from a tariff and taxing perspective on U.S. goods in your country, or so on and so on. Like, it really gives us a negotiation tactic. And I know I just pointed out Japan there because they're the one that has the most troops, and they have, I think out of this list, definitely their largest debt holder. Is that here's where we can negotiate and drive supply and demand increases through military protection, because for better or worse, we are kind of the world police. I'm not going to say that's right or wrong. Again, this is not a political video. This is a job market video. But if we make some trade negotiation deals of saying, hey, you're going to import 10% more U.S. goods for this defense. Okay, that could be huge from a demand perspective, right? If they are continually buying these things. Or, hey, we're going to, for this protection, that's going to get paid for through this, by you reducing the tariff, which makes our goods cheaper, which brings money back into our economy. So we can really use the military, because we're using it from a global protection standpoint, we can parlay that into trade negotiations, which has been talked about as a way to generate the revenue. Or let's just say you don't even want to go that complex. Hey, for these 53,000 soldiers, you're going to pay, I don't know, $20,000 per soldier per month, right? That then increases the revenue to the U.S. Going back to some of the previous discussions we've had, right? This would allow them to decrease government spending effectively and put more people back into the economy, or help contribute to the lesser debt, which gives the U.S. more negotiation power, more global power from an economic perspective, which allows us to use our leverage to increase more demand and increase supply. And so it just creates this vicious cycle. So it could just be that, hey, you're going to make money, or you're going to pay us for the protection, period, end of story. And that in and of itself is going to have an effect on companies' revenue generation and impact. And so it could go a negotiation into trade for military, or just, hey, our military is going to generate revenue, which is then going to lead to decreased deficits, decreased debt, and increased U.S. dollar power, decreased inflation, so on and so forth. Now, and just to give an idea here, we've talked about different billions of dollars here and billions of dollars there, and millions of jobs or thousands of jobs, so on and so forth. Just to give an idea, so the military perspective, so they just had their 7th audit in a row. So they do annual audits now for the last 7 years. And I haven't seen the specific numbers. I know they didn't do well. But just to give you an idea of a military DOD audit, in 2022, fiscal year 2022, they couldn't account for 60% of their military assets, which totaled $3.5 trillion. Okay, that's roughly like 8% of our debt, total debt, that they couldn't account for. So if we turn them into a revenue generation machine and we increase auditing and accountability, this is something to where, again, if we ran math here, let's just say we made up all of that 8%. That means that in roughly 12 years from this one single initiative, well, just from making them get back that 3.5 trillion, in roughly 12 years, we're out of debt. Or at the very least, it might be 15 or something like that, because we might have to make up a little bit of our deficit, and that goes towards that a little bit. And then every year we're in a surplus from this 3.5 trillion. Then you turn them into a revenue generation machine. Now you're talking about a double dip that, the U.S. is out of debt faster. And the U.S. being out of debt, why this matters from a job market perspective, and it's not just a political discussion, is because this is what dictates the value of the U.S. dollar. It dictates inflation. It dictates our leverage in trade negotiations. So as we can decrease our debt, increase the revenue for the government, which is going to come from either revenue generation flat out, aka more sales, which in this case would be taxes. That could either be taxes on people or taxes on other governments. So increasing revenue, or decreasing spending, DOGE, laying off people, deregulation, etc., or a combination of both. That gives us more power, that when we go to the table with a China, Germany, UK, Japan, etc., they don't have the debt looming over our head as a negotiation tactic, but we have their defense. We have the fact that we are the number one or number 2 largest GDP, largest consumer economy in the world that they could lose access to. So many things that really would lead to a decreased cost of goods, increase demand in goods globally, and therefore create those jobs, make your day-to-day life easier, and you're going to spend more money because your day-to-day life is also cheaper, which then leads to more economic growth and a reinvestment across the board. So the military revenue stream is a very interesting one that I think is brushed under the rug for a lot of people to talk about, simply by either holding them accountable or actually making money on our global world police defensive perspective, or reducing that, right? It could be any combination of these three mechanisms could actually lead to significant job growth, because it's overall going to impact our negotiations at the global level and the power of the US dollar. So that is everything that I really wanted to talk about here. So the trends that I've seen as a coach, the BLS market statistics, tariffs, DOGE, immigration, military, and how all this can really affect the 2025 job market outlook. So if I had to sum this up, it's a lot of what I said in the beginning. I do not have all of the answers. Nobody does. A lot of this job market outlook and prediction is going to come down to the way it's implemented and how much ego there is at the government to government level in those negotiations. And that is really what it's going to be. I think most of these things, not most, when we look at the government layoffs, when we look at the tariffs, and we look at, we look at those two things, I think they're likely to have a short-term negative on the overall economy and the overall job market outlook. There's going to be some pain felt by these two things. Now, the only way tariffs doesn't have a short-term negative is if the threat of the U.S. tariffs eliminate them as a whole, or they balance out at least. Hey, you have a 10%, you have a 10% on us, we're going to do a 10% on you. And we just make it a level playing field. Those are the only two ways I think that ends up not being negative. So, and there is a high chance of that. But I also think there's going to be some ego involved that's going to lead to some games of chicken that is going to lead to a demand plummet in some industries and some lines of work temporarily until the game of chicken is over. And then the government layoffs is just flat out supply and demand, economics 101. You're going to increase the workforce supply. The question is by how much? But these things can be offset in the long term. So I think 2025, here's my succinct prediction. I think 2025 Q1, so January to the end of March, is going to be much of what we've seen here in December. I think it's going to be a continuation of really strict hiring practices, very selective hiring practices, and some people still feeling like the job market isn't great. I think Q2 is where we're going to start to get some of the implementation happening on these things. And I think that, again, it's going to be a continued stagnation. I think Q3, so we're talking from July until the end of September, I think this is where we start to see either fruits of these efforts in labor, or poison from these efforts in labor. And it's like I said, it's going to come down to the implementation. I think some of these things are going to take those 3 to 6 months of the initial presidency and implementation for these effects to be felt. Some of the short-term positives, I think, will be the deportation effort, will be military negotiations, and the deregulation. I think that these three things will lead to the short-term positives. The question is, since there is kind of an equal pros and cons for short-term pain versus short-term benefit, which one wins? I think that's what's unknown and will remain to be seen. So I would approach 2025 with this. I'm going to go back to how I originally started with the trends that I saw. Be prepared to seek a new job. Be prepared to change careers. Be prepared to relocate. If you are unable to do any of those three things, figure out why. Do you need coaching advice on how to get there? Do you need to update your resume? Do you need to update your LinkedIn? Do you need to network with people? Do you need to look at a different industry? Whatever's preventing you from relocating, changing careers, or learning new things, solve that problem. That is how you approach the 2025 job market. Do not expect in 2025 to get the same job you had before it. And don't expect that that job is going to be the same skill set. So between now and tomorrow, start sprucing up your resume, cover letters, LinkedIn. Figure out the skill gaps that you have in this technological digital transformation age and figure out how to learn them and start learning them through Udemy, through Coursera, going back to college, getting certifications, that self-pay stuff, whatever it might be. That's how I would approach 2025 job market. I don't think anybody has the answer, so approach it with a question mark and protect yourself. Look out for you as the candidate and set yourself up to change your location, change your career, change your skill set, and start today. That is my answer to all of these questions, because I think it's going to be a mixed bag. I wouldn't be shocked if there's 100 different changes from an economic and political standpoint in 2025, and we enter 2026 feeling the same, because some of this stuff takes time to work out. I also would not be shocked if we get through 2025 and by the end of it, jobs available is decreased by 10% and unemployment has skyrocketed. I also will not be shocked if we end 2025 with the lowest unemployment rate we have ever had, along with the highest growth in GDP and skyrocketing of the U.S. economy. I think all three are truly equal outcomes. And so the best you can do is be prepared for any of those outcomes. Be prepared to relocate, be prepared for a new career, or at the very least, be prepared for a new skill set within your current career. If you look at tomorrow the same way you do today, or even worse, you look at tomorrow like you did yesterday, you will suffer in the upcoming 2025 and probably 2026 job market. Do not put yourself in a box. And that is what I have to say about the 2025 upcoming job market, the trends I've seen, how these policies can affect the pros and cons of each one. And I will be breaking this video up into multiple parts. If you watched all of this or you see this ending, I really appreciate it. I appreciate you sticking with me. If you like this video, if you want to see more of this content, hit the like button, hit the subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell. And until next time, I appreciate you. Thank you.